agent theory is basically an attempt to mathematically flesh out this idea of consciousness being fundamental. Don Hoffman calls conscious realism, that the universe can be fully described by a network of conscious agents. I would say most consciousness researchers now would converge on something like equating consciousness with subjective experience. I would add to that, it's our entry point into consciousness. Consciousness is infinitely bigger than our individual subjective experience. I would say the universe consists of an infinite collection of subjective experiences.
Dr. Robert Prentner is a philosopher, consciousness researcher, and friend of the podcast, trying to do something pretty outrageous: write the mathematics of conscious experience that make up reality itself. It's called the conscious agent theory, the idea that the physical universe we inhabit, everything you can touch, smell, or see, emerges from the interactions between conscious agents. This places consciousness more fundamental than physical matter. Don't worry, I don't really know what that sentence means either, but in this episode we're gonna find out together. But before we do that, please remember to subscribe to the channel if you want to know whether your entire life is happening in reality or is just a hallucination on the universe's settings menu.
There's this minimal structure which is called the conscious agent, and it's just a collection of perceptions, subjective experiences, and actions. And those actions are related to these experiences. And they're just represented as points or elements of a mathematical space.
Interactions between those agents build up literally every single thing in the universe.
Yes, I think that would be a fair characterization, yes.
When you say consciousness is fundamental, are you making the claim that the universe has a subjective experience, that there is an experience of what it is like to be the universe?
Well, I would say, I think it somehow dovetails with what you outlined, but it gets a bit more radical than that.
Dr. Robert Prentner, a huge welcome back to The Giant Shoulder. I enjoyed our first conversation so much, so I'm excited for you to melt every neuron in my brain once again for round two.
Yes, hello everyone. Thanks for having me, Evan. Great to be here, and I'm looking very much forward.
Something I realized in our conversation is that somehow we managed to say the word consciousness probably 200 times each, but I never actually got you to define it. I never got your working definition. And I only realized that while watching it. So maybe it would be useful to start off this one with your working definition of consciousness.
Okay, so that's a very important question, actually, and I think it's even more important than most of the people think. I mean, as consciousness researcher, what often happens is that people come to us, so like at a conference, and someone comes, well, what are you talking about? You don't have this definition of consciousness, so give me this definition. And I would say most consciousness researchers now would converge on something like equating consciousness with subjective experience.
Yes.
There's this famous definition in the literature from this paper. Someone is conscious if and only if it is like something for this person.
That would be mine, basically. Yeah, I
think that's a very good starting point. But I would add something to that. So last time we spoke about this interface perspective that I kind of like. And this interface perspective, so this whole idea is that the way how we perceive the world is an interface, and perception is an interface to this world, and specifically to consciousness. And tying those to this idea of defining consciousness as subjective experience, which I think is very good. But I would add to that, it's our entry point into consciousness. Consciousness is infinitely bigger than our individual subjective experience. But that's the only, at least at the moment, that's the only point where we can get a glimpse into this, whatever consciousness really is. So I think it's subjective experience, but it's even a bit larger than that. So subjective experience gives us one glimpse or represents one part of this. So I would be very happy to say something like subjective consciousness is the fundamental nature of reality or something like that. I would be very happy with that. I know that most people are actually not happy with that. But then asking them, give me a definition of it, like asking them what would be, when you ask me what is the definition of consciousness, that would amount to asking them, oh, give me now a definition of physical reality. And that's
Yeah.
a very hard question, actually.
Yes. I'd say it might be the hardest question. So this is why I think I struggle with consciousness being fundamental, because this idea of subjectivity being at its core. When you say consciousness is fundamental, are you making the claim that the universe has a subjective experience, that there is an experience of what it is like to be the universe?
Well, I would say the universe. Now I have to be careful now. I would say the universe consists of an infinite collection of subjective experiences. Whether that itself instantiate a subjective experience, I would be a bit careful. I mean, our subjective experience that we as humans have typically involves something like selves or time experience, something like that. And of course, there's a big discussion what is really at the core of our subjective experience. Now, if you speak about any entity other than humans, um, this question is even a bit more difficult. And if you imply by saying, "Oh, the universe has a subjective experience attached to it," do you mean that the universe is something like a self, has a self attached to it?
No, I
And
don't think
there, I
so.
would say, probably not.
Yeah, it can be completely detached from human subjective experience, right? I think most people would agree, or at least I think most neuroscientists would agree, that like a dog has subjective experience, a bat,
Yes.
as Thomas Nagel, has subjective experience, an ant maybe, a plant maybe, a bacteria maybe.
Mm.
Each have their own subjective experience, but there could be very little in common with those experiences. So do you think it's possible the universe has a subjective experience, but of course, it looks nothing like any subjective experience that we would ever experience ourselves or even understand?
Oh, then I would say yes. I mean, that's a possibility.
Very cool.
I wouldn't
Very,
mind
very
that. So
interesting.
I only would object to this. There's this objection to panpsychism, which is like this, this incredulous stare objection. What, you think that this little electron self exists or something like that? And I think a similar objection can be made if someone claims something like, oh, there's a subjective experience associated with the universe. And similar as the panpsychist really doesn't like this kind of anthropomorphizing of electrons. I don't like it if you do it
Yes.
with the universe.
Yes. So, as you said, we talked a lot about the interface theory of perception, which I think is profoundly cool as an idea. And I'll get you to define it again. We're going to talk about it a little bit later. But I wanted to go into the conscious agent theory first. Can you define it in hopefully simple terms, and we can go from there?
Well, conscious agent theory is basically an attempt to mathematically flesh out this idea of consciousness being fundamental, um, in the sense that typically those people who are into conscious agent theory have this additional theoretical commitment, which Don Hoffman calls conscious realism, um, that the universe can be fully described by a network of conscious agents. A conscious agent is just a structure of having experiences and doing something with that, having actions on which are defined, which are caused or which are kind of steered by our experiences. And in conscious agent theory, you would assume that you write a network, you have a network of these things, and everything in the universe can be represented by these networks, or by interface representations or representations of these networks.
And what is an agent in this framework? I presume, of course, humans are agents, but we're probably very high level agents.
Yes.
What is like maybe the minimal agent in
So,
this sort of
and
framework?
that's the core of the theory, actually. So there's this minimal structure which is called the conscious agent, and it's just a collection of perceptions, subjective experiences, and actions. And those actions are related to these experiences, and they're just represented as points or elements of a mathematical space, of a set with some structure.
So anything capable of subjective experience and taking an action is a conscious agent, and interactions between those agents build up literally every single thing in the universe.
Yes, that would be, I think that would be a fair characterization, yes.
So what kind of claims can we make from that? Because that's such a strange idea. It's hard to even wrap your head around. You've spent a lot of time thinking about this kind of idea. Like what are the implications of this? What claims can be drawn from this? What does that really mean?
Well, I think one interesting question is whether we can, or I mean, that would be the hypothesis that we can, um, whether we can define any structure which we think would describe something like objective reality. Objective meaning independent of consciousness, like space time, physical stuff, embodiment, or whatever you want to have, um, as a representation of these networks. That's the main idea. So it basically turns around this question. Normally, we would ask something like, okay, how can we represent consciousness as, I don't know, caused or identical to some neural processes? And then we write down an equation or a model of a neuron, and we would kind of describe it in terms of that. And the conscious agent theory basically turns around this whole question.
So it doesn't make any claim about how this fundamental force interacts with our biological systems, imbues me with my subjective experience, imbues you. And to correct me if you think that the verbiage I'm using here isn't correct here. There's a fundamental force, and I don't even know if force is necessarily the correct word, but something fundamental. It's interacting with my biological wetware in some way, my cells, my metabolism, my brain, and then it gives me my subjective experience. And the same with you, and same with everyone else. Is that correct? That's where we get our sense of subjectivity from.
I wouldn't say it gives you your subjective experience, but it mediates a certain, well, it mediates consciousness, and that results in the subjective experience that you have. Now, to what you said, I think that's a very nice kind of proposal that you have. But in order to cash that out in conscious agent theory, you would need to, how did you say the physical system that defines you, the body, the biological system, to kind of redefine that in terms of conscious agent theory. And then it would be an interaction within the theory. And that would give you a certain prediction. I think that's a very nice way of thinking about it. So I can give you an analogy, but I'm not sure whether it's very helpful. Because the analogy involves the history of philosophy. There was a famous philosopher, German philosopher called Leibniz, and Leibniz had this what he called the monadology. So he believed that the universe is a network of monads, basically, a collection of monads. And one question in this framework that many people had is how to think about physical stuff, how to think about bodies specifically, human biological bodies. And I think somewhere he gave a very interesting answer. It's a part of this network, monad network or conscious agent network in the analogy, that is represented by another part of the network. So what we call bodies would be just a specific way of representing a certain part of this network. And then you can study interactions between this part of the network and the whole rest of the network. And the proposal would then be that your subjective experience is given by, if you want to use that word, is given by these interactions between different subnetworks.
Is it worth drawing a distinction between consciousness researchers often talk about phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness? Would I be right in saying that access consciousness, which is sort of our cognitive processing, our knowledge base, this sort of stuff, is that biologically rooted in your mind? And then it's phenomenal consciousness, which is the sensation of seeing red, or the subjective experience of being Evan, of being Robert. That is the more fundamental consciousness stuff, and that isn't biologically rooted. Is that a fair distinction? Can you make that claim?
Yes and no. I think when you talk about axis consciousness, there are slightly different ways to think about it. I think most people would actually think about axis consciousness in terms of a functionalist or maybe even computationalist perspective. It's a sort of function or computation that the brain does, or that some biological organisms does. So I would that would be a refinement which I would bring to that. But this idea that phenomenal consciousness is more related to the, let's say, or is related to what is more fundamental. I think that I would say that's a fair characterization.
2025 is the year that me and you are going to fix our sleep. Now, that does not mean that we need to go full Brian Johnson on it, but one thing we can do that's super easy is to buy the highest quality sleep mask on the market, and that is Manta. I've been blown away by how much better I sleep with one of these on. It's just a fact that people are not sleeping in completely dark environments, and studies show that affects sleep quality, time to get to sleep, and increases the fragmentation of your sleep. I have tried other sleep masks. I first bought one on Amazon last year for like €5, but the problem is they're just really poor quality. They don't really block out any of the light, and you can't adjust them to your planet-sized head. Manta is fully adjustable, so it literally will fit all of the strangest and weirdest size heads out there, like mine. The Manta mask is literally completely blackout. I have studio lights coming at me from here, and I can't tell the difference. It is absolutely pitch black. This is the perfect environment that you need for sleep. Manta honestly feels like you're being cuddled by a cloud. I actively enjoy and look forward to putting these on each night. I just realized how boring that makes my life sound. I sleep with Manta every single night, and I've seen direct improvements in the quality, duration, and how rested I feel when I wake up. My Whoop data seems to agree. Manta have a bunch of different sleep masks on their website. I have tried the normal sleep mask as well as the sound mask. I like to listen to audiobooks at night, so for that reason, the sound mask was actually really, really good. For some reason, my girlfriend doesn't want to listen to how reality is a perception at 11 o'clock when we're trying to sleep. So this was a really good solution for that. It's also incredibly comfortable. But as I said, I think for most people, like 90% of people, the normal ordinary mask is going to fill their requirements. Super comfortable and completely adjustable. Literally is just a really high quality, well-made product. It's the best on the market. Manta are giving my viewers 10% off their first sleep mask. They ship internationally, and they also offer a 60-day free trial. That's 59 of the best nights of sleep you've ever had. I literally promise that. But if for any reason you aren't satisfied, you will get your money back, no questions asked. I really couldn't recommend more if you're looking to do something to improve your sleep. A sleep mask is the lowest hanging fruit. It's so simple and easy to apply, and I think it will benefit your life and overall health, and I could not recommend Manta more.
What's so interesting to me is I've been building this sort of materialist worldview and materialist story as I go on with this podcast, and I pick up another line from a different researcher, and it's building this materialist scaffold for me, and it seems like a really plausible story. It's incomplete. The jigsaw puzzle definitely has missing pieces, but I think I have a reasonable explanation for consciousness within a material worldview. And I'm really curious why you think this fundamental consciousness idea is more likely. You know, you're familiar with...
Now you need to give me the explanation that you have.
Okay. So this really comes from, I think, Peter Godfrey Smith is a big, and Anil Seth are sort of big, inspirations of mine for these kind of ideas. So let's zoom back 800 million years ago, right? We have a basic organism in the sea, and it's developing its first kind of nervous systems. And the way I think of these sort of basic nervous systems are that what they're for is for sensing in the environment, sensing sort of signals in the environment that are meaningful to that organism. So it's starting to differentiate signals sort of such as this is dangerous, this is food, and then it's integrating those different environmental stimulus in relation to its own body state. So for me, this is where subjectivity starts to arise. When you when you start integrating the information of there's food over there, but I ate 6 hours ago, so I only sort of need that food, and there's a predator over here, and all of these are coming in via different sensors and being integrated by that primitive neural net. And once you start integrating those different features together, the environmental stimulus with its own desire for basically persisting, for persisting and living, that seems like subjectivity to me. That seems like agency. And for me, that's really what consciousness is. It's a way to feel through complex problems. That's Mark Solms's words there. So consciousness is a control system evolved by an organism to feel its way through a complex problem. And that complex problem is there's food over there, but there's a predator over here, and I ate 6 hours ago, and last time I ate this happened, and last time I went there, the predator. So all of these different features, you're integrating all of those different things. So for me, consciousness is really integrated information. So I draw a lot of things from IIT there as well. But that seems like a totally plausible scenario for me. And I get a few other points on that, I guess. So I don't think consciousness emerges from matter. I think that's sneaking in dualism. I got that from David Papineau. He says, I reject the hard problem because it sort of sneaks in dualism. I just think that once you integrate all of those features, that's what consciousness is. And the reason it feels like something is because if hunger didn't feel like something, it wouldn't cause the organism to act. And then that organism might not be selected for when the organism that was hungry and felt that hunger viscerally in its body and caused it to act, that's going to outcompete the organism that didn't feel its way through that problem. And I know that there's holes in that jigsaw puzzle, but it's like that makes sense to me. Consciousness is a control system that evolved for an organism to feel its way through a complex problem. And it's crucially about integrating information. It's crucially about subjectivity and gaining agency. And all of the complexity we see in the human consciousness today is from millions of years of integrating different features. And now whenever I make a decision, I'm integrating so much different. I need to go to the gym because I need to be fit, because I want to be attractive to women, because I want to help my heart health, because there's just so many different things that we're integrating into that conscious experience. And that's why now we have such a rich idea. But I think it started back there in the seas, in these basic neural networks that were making these very primitive integrations. Yeah, and that seems plausible to me. It makes sense. And then when you think about fundamental consciousness, I'm just like, that just seems like more of a stretch than that materialist organism view. But I'm curious, what do you think of that picture? What do you think about that narrative?
So I mean, I think it's actually a very interesting narrative for various reasons. I mean, some of the sources that you draw from that already indicate that you would say, okay, consciousness is more a very primitive phenomenon. Actually, it's probably not only related to what's going on in the neocortex, for example. You said like 800 million years ago, this stuff already happened, right? And you also reject dualism. You also said that.
Yes.
So I think the scenario that makes most sense in your picture would be something like a dual aspect monism, where you have one process and it appears in two different ways, something like that. And I think Mark Solms is also kind of on board with this kind of picture. I think that's actually one of the. So if I weren't thinking or believing or taking a consciousness as fundamental stance, then I would probably then it would be one of the better candidates. And as you said, it's not a typical materialist theory with emergence and I don't know what. I'm kind of reject it. So I think that's already quite interesting. Difficult question, I think, for your explanation is when does information integration actually start? And what is this nature of information that you think about?
Yes.
Where does it come from? And how do you define it? I mean, we kind of always talk about information, and we mention this word, like we do not really think about it. But as soon as we start to think, what does information actually mean? Then we get actually into trouble. And I think a very nice perspective, which comes from this conscious agent stuff that I'm interested in, is to say, well, information is fundamentally constrained or defined even by something which is more fundamental than that. And candidate for that would be consciousness. So I think it somehow dovetails with what you outlined, but it gets a bit more radical than that even.
Yeah. I'd like to also say that I think the narrative that I laid out there, I think, is perfectly coherent with this fitness beats theorem, fitness beats truth evolutionary game theorem. I think it's perfectly coherent with that. Could you talk about that work and that experiment you did? 'Cause I know we talked about it a little in the first conversation, but I find that really interesting, and I think that's quite instructive to how I've sort of sculpted that narrative as well. Can you talk about that work a bit?
Sure. So there's this old story about perception and veridicality. So how good does perception fit to the objective world? And the intuition that many people have, and probably I still have it to some extent, is that our perceptions need to be accurately reflecting what's going on in order to ensure certain fitness relevant processing, in order to facilitate survival. And in the fitness beats truth theorem, it tries to formalize this claim and puts it to test by using what's called evolutionary games, where you have organisms which represent some stuff, and based on this representation, they derive actions. So you said that basically what you say, consciousness is actually at the root of consciousness, experiencing the world and then acting on it.
Yeah.
And this fitness beats truth theorem is basically exactly based on this idea. And now you have a competition between, let's say, two kinds of strategies or two kinds of organisms. One that does whatever maximizes fitness or helps to optimize fitness, and one that tries to infer some objective structure and then optimizes fitness. And the fitness beats truth theorem tries to or shows mathematically that the first option is always more successful than the second one. So tuning your actions to fitness is always better than tuning it to some objective structure out there. Objective truth, as it was called in a paper, where truth is somehow confusing some people. It's not meaning, well, there's this long discussion, what is truth actually? But here in this context, truth just means something which holds independent from the perceiver or the observer or the creature that is engaged in this process. So something like an objective notion.
This makes complete sense.
Truth theorem always says that takes the back seat when it comes to these competition processes.
Yeah. I think we have a really clear example of this, which is just color perception. Color is just wavelengths of light, but a highly useful way of interpreting wavelengths of light is to differentiate based on some color perception. It means that we can tell when an apple is ripe and not ripe. That's some of the earlier evolutionary ideas for why we developed color vision, was like, so early animals can figure out when food was good to eat, or what food was poisonous to us, or what food. So that makes sense to me. That is a way that we have taken a signal from bedrock reality, which is light in different wavelengths, and we have developed a perceptual system, a way of interpreting that information that's useful for us. But like, color doesn't exist in any way. There is no objective color. So I think that's just maybe a useful framework to understand an example of that. But there's clearly many examples of this. But these that's what I mean. These simulations, I think, are perfectly coherent with current sort of neuroscience ideas of predictive processing, constructed emotions. All of these ideas are very coherent with those ideas. So what I don't understand is that you have these nice evolutionary games that prove perception evolves for fitness over truth. Absolutely. Where does the next step come from of saying consciousness is fundamental when that, like, those game theory simulations seem like evidence for, all of very current neuroscience, the most current ideas around predictive processing and everything else.
Yes, I think that's an important point. The interface theory of perception um, is to some extent metaphysically neutral. It doesn't force you on any particular specific point, although it suggests a kind of, well, a quasi transcendentalist approach. I don't know whether that
Could you
resonates
define? I
somehow.
think quasi
There, there,
transcendentalist
there,
might
there-
require
there's a
some.
well-known philosopher, German philosopher Immanuel Kant, and he said like, okay, the way how we or there's this famous quip. Now I need to translate it in my head because I only read it in German. Um, that the that our cognition doesn't follow the object, but the objects follow our cognitions.
Right.
Cognition is a bit of a unfortunate translation, actually, but it's the kind of how we get to know, how we know the world.
Yeah.
Um, and I think it's very similar to what you say what you would say in interface theory. And you're right, you could try to embed that into a perfectly standard or mainstream neuroscience perspective. I think that's perfectly fine. The only difficulty, or maybe not the only difficulty, but one difficulty is if you want to try to talk about consciousness based on that, how to fit in consciousness there. And there it depends a bit on whether you take the hard problem seriously or not. If you don't take it
I
seriously,
don't tend to take it that seriously.
then you could say, okay, I don't take it seriously, and I apply maybe this idea. So maybe our kind of perception of subjective things in the world is a somewhat useful fiction or something like that. I think you can go there, actually. Logically, that seems to be possible to go there. I'm not sure whether it's really a comfortable place to go, because then in the end you are kind of,
I'm not sure any of this is comfortable.
yeah, no, probably not. You end up with a very deflationary view about consciousness. But I think it's logically quite coherent to do that, actually. And you might say you have the approval of neuroscience and of physics when you do that. So
Yeah.
that's on your side, actually. Now, if you take the hard problem seriously, and if you think that there is a difficulty in making this jump from physics or from information processing to consciousness, then you might also choose to go the other way. You might say, oh, well, let's start with consciousness and then say, okay, the physical world is this interface stuff. And I think that's very close to what I and Don and others are doing. You could actually also have this option to say, okay, you take neither consciousness nor physical stuff. You take something else. But then you even have more work.
Yeah. Do you think conscious agent theory? Because for me, that doesn't get around the hard problem. It kind of just introduces a reverse hard problem, where
Yes.
instead of thinking about how the brain or the biological system instantiates consciousness, you have to think about how this fundamental force interacts with the biology in some way to create consciousness. Is that not just kind of a reverse hard problem, equally impenetrable?
Okay, now when you say the reverse hard problem, I initially expected you to say something like, "Oh, you start with consciousness, and now you have to create the physical stuff that's going on." And I think that's true. That's a hard problem, but it's a bit. It seems to be a little less hard than the normal hard problem. But then you said
That's
something a
funny.
little bit different, actually.
Yeah, well,
You said about this interaction with biological stuff,
yeah, well,
and there I have to think about.
yeah. There's some claim there that my phenomenology, my subjectivity, is from some interaction with the bedrock reality, which you say is consciousness and my biological wetware. Like,
Mhm.
I assume my biological wetware has something to do with my phenomenology, because it's what makes me Evan and makes you Robert. So
Mhm.
there is some interaction. And then that's what I mean by the reverse hard problem. You either have consciousness interacting with biology to give phenomenology, or you have biology interacting with consciousness to create phenomenology, or something along those lines. Do you understand what I mean?
Yes. So in the standard view, you have what's often referred to, or what's sometimes referred to, as a generation problem. You have to kind of explain how you get consciousness out of non-consciousness.
Yeah.
And in the other thing, you don't have that problem. Of course, you have other problems, but not this specific one. And if you think that the generation problem is infinitely hard, um, then you might not want to go there.
Yeah. It just seems equally hard to me. And you said, funnily enough, that you think you said that it seems slightly less hard for consciousness to be fundamental and build physical matter. I'm curious why you think that's
Oh
slightly
yes.
less hard.
Well, I think this idea that you start with perceptions and that you kind of say, okay, physical objects are constellations of perceptions, or they're moments of perceptions, or defined structures of perceptions, seems to be somehow more viable than saying, okay, you start with physical stuff and somehow that you get consciousness out of that. However that works. That seems
That's
to be
funny.
more mysterious to me.
I don't share that intuition, I don't think. But I guess that's my natural training versus your natural training and all of your years of playing with these ideas. I don't necessarily see that.
Maybe. So intuitions are a difficult thing actually, because they are kind of constantly evolving and they really depend on the context where you kind of grow up. Um,
Yes.
yeah, I mean I think that's a fundamental intuition that um, someone who is prone to say that consciousness is fundamental has, namely the intuition that it's easier to get physics from consciousness than the other way around.
Interesting. Yeah, I'd never thought about it like that. Do you think that some of the proclivity to say that consciousness is fundamental comes from this idea that, people often say that that's a more meaningful idea? Like,
Mm.
people seem to be quite reductive of the meaning that exists within a materialist worldview. That's also an intuition that I've never really understand. I'm very fulfilled and happy and love my life and very interested in the universe and learning things purely in a material worldview. It doesn't seem less meaningful to me. But I think it's quite a common one, and I've heard Don Hoffman talk about this quite a lot, where he seems to think materialism, just is a bit more devoid of meaning than a consciousness being fundamental. Do you think that's one of the driving factors towards that intuition of thinking you can build physics from consciousness, is that way seems more meaningful?
Yes, I think that's. I would say it's another intuition, or it's the intuition that if you have a physicalist worldview, then you have difficulties to find meaning there, or it seems to be void of meaning. And of course, the physicalist would reply, "No, that's not true.
Yeah.
Here is our model of that." And and again, then it comes a bit to, I mean, if it's a question about what intuitions you have, then it's a question about that, and then people have the intuition or don't have the intuition. But I think that you're perfectly right to point it out, that there's a difference in intuition. Now, I give you what I find an interesting example. So I'm just reading a book with my class, by David Chalmers. It's called Reality Plus.
Hmm.
Um, and he argues in that book that um, you could live a meaningful life in a virtual world. A lot of people have this idea, well, if our reality is somehow simulated, if we live in a simulation, then nothing is real and we can't experience any meaning. And Chalmers said, well, not quite actually, not the other way around. The things are real as virtual objects, and meaning you can have meaningful interactions in these virtual realities. And to a lot of people, that sounds completely anti-intuitive.
Mm.
And I think that's a very similar intuition than this kind of intuition, no meaning in a purely physical world,
Interesting.
which I actually also have. But I mean, more on a meta level, I would say. There are different kinds of intuition, and yeah.
Do you think you personally gain more meaning in your life believing that consciousness is fundamental?
Well, on the one hand, I would say I would want to say yes, but then on the other hand, I, I would. That's an answer which would apply to myself only, I guess. It would feel a bit
Yeah.
preposterous to say that, oh, you all have to switch to this consciousness as fundamental story in order to kind of enhance the perception of meaningfulness. I wouldn't want to make that claim.
No, I'm only asking you in this case.
But if you're asking me personally,
Yeah.
yeah, I think so, yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, because for me, there's nothing more marvelous than that sort of biological story. It's just it's
Hmm.
beautiful for me. I'm obsessed with that biology. I think it's beautiful, and I think there's so much. I get so much fulfillment and meaning in just learning about that biology. And for me, it is almost mystical or spiritual that how just bizarrely crazy complex and beautiful and incredible the biological system is. Like that's meaning. I don't need to say, well, oh, it's just matter, because matter is pretty phenomenal. And I've also started kind of making that shift of not thinking about biological matter as just matter and thinking about more of is information. So I had a conversation with Nikolai Kukushkin, and he
Mm.
sort of really he drilled this into me. It's like, atoms and molecules in a biological system were never really atoms and molecules. They were essences. They were ideas. They were not energy, not in a traditional sense, but they were essences. And
Mhm.
thinking about biology that way is so much more interesting. And I think it's
I
all
think actually, I think so too. I would
yeah,
perfectly agree with you. I would just
yeah,
go the further step and say, oh, atoms and molecules outside of biology are just ideas, patterns of information.
yeah, right, yeah. But
I
in
think,
biology, they have maybe a lot more meaning and a lot more information carrying, or at least that's what I would say, or intrinsic to the biology. Like thinking about DNA,
Mhm.
thinking about DNA as matter is not a useful way of thinking about DNA. DNA is information. I am, and I think it's also an interesting way of thinking about how, or it's an interesting frame shift in thinking about this whole idea of like, oh, how can mind emerge from matter? Well, if you switch matter from not really being matter but being information, you can be like, okay, well, consciousness could evolve from information. The way Nikolai says it, like it kind of folds out from information. I was like, that seems completely plausible to me. Would you agree with that? How in general do you think about information? You brought that up at the start. That's a
so I think first observation, which I find very interesting when you talk about biology, you kind of said DNA. It's better to think of DNA as a piece of information.
yeah,
Um, I agree to some extent. Now, in biology, it's really important what you do with this stuff, right?
yeah,
The information just it doesn't only sit there. It needs to be transcribed. It needs to be converted. You have proteins that do some job and that kind of feedbacks on this whole mechanism, self-sustaining and all these nice characterizations that you have in biology. And it's very different from how we normally think about information.
mm,
Like classically, when we say, oh, we have this syntactic information theory where it just defines zero or not, and then you have a bit and whatnot. That seems really not what biological systems are actually, or how biological systems are best characterized. You
yeah,
can characterize them as informational systems. I think that's a valid perspective, but then you would need to add um, that you have to do something with this information. That information carries a sense of meaning intrinsic to the biological system.
exactly, yeah,
Um, And I think that's already a very interesting perspective, which is kind of close to taking this consciousness as fundamental thing, even though that's a bit more of a radical leap, I would say. But um, it's very similar. So when you say, okay, now you have a physics as information, they eat from bit for you, and then you say, okay, that's fine. Um, but similar as information in biology is not just kind of syntactic and sits there. It's information that is intrinsic to the universe, that the universe does something with.
yeah.
And then it's a very similar view. It's a kind of biologizing of this informational concept. brought to the
Yes.
fundamental level.
Yeah, this information is one of those concepts that I've been trying to understand better and sort of evolve my mental model of, because it's a very strange one about how to think about information. You
Mm.
have physicists on one side saying that, or some physicists, some theoretical physicists saying that information is the bedrock of reality and that information is more fundamental than matter.
Mm.
But the way I understand information is that it sort of is about the configuration of matter. It's explaining how matter is arranged. So it's a bit of a head melter of how something that is defined on its configuration of something can be more fundamental than that thing itself. Do you understand what I mean? If information describes matter, how can it be more fundamental than
Yes.
matter?
So I think, I mean, it really depends a bit on which physicist you're asking about. So even
Yeah.
among those physicists who would say information is fundamental, um, they might slightly differ in what they actually mean by that. Um,
Yeah.
but one thing that you could mean by that would be to say, okay, it's about the information that you can gain via measurements. It's not about the structure of some materially pre-existing things, but it's about what you can say about these systems when you do measurements. And it seems to be that information is a nice way to encapsulate that.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that's more at the root when you say, when physicists would say, okay, the fundamental nature of reality is information.
Would you say that conscious agent theory is sort of grounded in information? Because am I right that there isn't physical units in conscious agent theory, or at least, yeah, or correct me if any of this is wrong.
Uh,
Again, it's more describing the relations between things and how relations between things can kind of build these networks, these scaffolds. So would it be correct to say that conscious agent theory is grounded in information, and that's actually would be making a claim towards information being the most fundamental substrate of
It
the
depends a
universe?
bit on what you mean by grounded. But I would actually put it the other way around. Information is grounded in consciousness.
Okay. Because I was kind of thinking, is information in some way consciousness? Like, are we using, are those words the same? And could those words be the same in this case? Like, are they actually the same
I
thing?
think that they could be very similar, at least. I'm not sure whether they could be the same, but they could be very similar. But when you say that consciousness is just information, and then people often have this sense of information that we know from traditional information theory, or we know we kind of associate with what computers would do, like computing for stuff. And that might be a bit of an impoverished um, concept if you also believe that that's something about the fundamental nature of the universe.
Okay. So
You
how
often hear
does
something like, all consciousness is, I don't know, the intrinsic nature of information, or the way how information processing feels, or something like that. And um, that's metaphor. I think that's a nice metaphorical way of talking. But to make it precise is very difficult.
yeah?
So I'm very sympathetic if you say consciousness and information are fundamentally related. Um, but then on the other hand, it might lead to this misassociation, and it's hard to make precise.
You think one of the ways that we could make inroads on consciousness is through information theory? Like, is that maybe the right level of analysis, or as close? Because if the ontology is something like
Mm.
consciousness, information, physics, almost the closest that we can kind of get to consciousness is information theory. You think
I
that's
think information theory is a good attempt, but there's this big caveat that normally information theory is defined purely syntactically, or the concept of information is defined purely syntactically. That figures in information theory. I think it needs to be an enriched form of information theory.
right? And how might you go about that, do you think?
I have no idea.
Yeah, that makes both of us okay. That's okay. That's good. If conscious agent theory was fully fleshed out and fully formalized
Mhm.
mathematically, should you be able to build up physical equations from it? Like, I was thinking about this, like, should you be able to derive Newtonian physics Maxwell's electrostatic, compulsion interactions, all of those things, should they all emerge from the conscious agent
Oh,
framework? Is that,
definitely, they should all fall out. I think
yeah,
that would be thing. I mean, Don Hoffman is actually pursuing a similar project, and I think it's a very difficult project, and it's a bit of a
yeah,
moonshot project, I would say.
yeah,
Um, but I think it's ultimately very consistent to think that that should be
right.
like the end result if you really flesh it out, as you said.
I
Um,
don't even know how you start doing that. Like that's so many levels of it's so far detached from my understanding of my level of mathematics that I have no idea how you even start doing that. Would you have any? Do you think there's any way for for the listeners to even gain a foot in the door of what the hell that process even looks like?
um, well, I can tell you a little bit about about the way how he thinks about it, and some of his collaborators. Um, when you go to fundamental physics, and you look at stuff that's happening there, and the way how we normally um, some of our best tools that we actually currently have, in particle physics, for example, are scattering amplitudes. And I think most physicists agree um, that computing these things via space-time is somehow limited, is fundamentally limited. Of course, most physicists then disagree on what would be the better thing to do. Um,
Yeah,
but in this conscious agent related framework of thinking, um, one would say, okay, the better way to do it um, would be to invoke conscious agent theory, and would be to write a network of conscious agents and then use mathematical tools to simplify it, and then to recover those things. And in theoretical physics, there are some attempts of using higher mathematics or using kind of cool mathematics where no one really knows what it is about to actually calculate this stuff. And um, I think Don's suggestion would be to say, okay, ground that in consciousness or ground that in the theory of conscious agent. That would be one way to go about it. But as I said, it's a bit of a moonshot project, I think.
yeah. I mean,
But it's very consistent. So philosophically, I think it's very nice.
I mean, how crazy would that be if we actually got some equations of particle physics or fields or something in physics? We were
That
able,
would be really
something
cool. That
fell
would
out
be
of
really
it.
cool. I would say that's 22nd century physics, but it's really cool physics.
Yeah, how far away do you think would you have any? I know predicting in the future is always
Yeah.
perilous. I think that was the exact quote from our first episode, actually. But what would you have any idea on when you might expect a physics equation to fall out of conscious agent theory, or something testable in reality? So something that it makes a prediction about how the world works, about how humans interact with it. When would that fall out of conscious agent theory?
So I think that depends a bit on how many people are working on it, and how many. I mean, there's so many really geniuses out there, and really intelligent people who can run circles around me and who know much more maths than me, and all other people that I work with. If those people are kind of convinced to work on this problem, then um, it could be reasonably fast, I guess. Um, or if I don't know if people like whoever believes in AGI or so, if the machines get clever enough and take on these problems, then it could be solved soon. Well, reasonably soon, a few decades or so, I guess. Um, but I mean, that's all big ifs, and you never know. But I think the important lesson is that even these very exotic ideas, they need to kind of fall on the right ground. I mean, you need to get it out to people and to the right people, and then a lot can happen.
Well, Donald Hoffman's a very convincing speaker. He's definitely getting the word out there. He's going on big podcasts. I know his episode with Stephen Bartlett just got like 4 million views, so it's definitely getting viewership. People are definitely interested in it. I mean, how could they not? How could they not be interested in the bedrock of reality? And he speaks so convincingly about it.
Right.
Do you, do you think we need to build super colliders? Like, is this a particle accelerator, high energy particle physics type experiment? Like I'm really trying to think about like what the experiment even looks like if we had infinite money and we're
Yeah.
trying to build conscious agent theory maths up from the ground and see if we can hit physical reality. Is that like we need to build more super colliders, more high energy physics? Is that sort of the area?
Um, well, I'm not a particle physicist, so it's hard for me to answer that conclusively. But um, yes, there are two stages, I would say. One stage is to kind of explain what we already have, explain the data that we have, and obviously we don't need new colliders for that. But the next step would be to predict some things that we don't already have, and then it might be actually a kind of nice idea to do that, to actually try to build those things. But on the other hand, whether it's economically feasible or whether we shouldn't use the money elsewhere,
Yeah.
there are many discussions. I mean, you have limited resources and you need to think about how best to spend them.
Yeah, we
So
might
I
be a
think it's
few.
not the only inroad to consciousness that we could make. It's one, a very nice one. If you're very convinced that, well, whatever is fundamental is ultimately something that the physicist will tell us, then that's the thing that you need to do.
Yeah.
Something that always strikes me when I talk to neuroscientists is just how staggeringly complex the brain really is. It's this incredible prediction engine, always trying to make sense of the world and keep us safe. But it's important to remember we're still running ape hardware. Our brains weren't even remotely built for the chaos of modern life. And sometimes they just get scrambled. I've recently had some difficulty in my own personal life, and I realized that it was about time my own ape prediction system got the gym workout and just rebalancing that it's probably needed for quite a long time. So I booked my first therapy session with BetterHelp, who I'm incredibly excited to be partnering with on this video. A massive umbrella review of hundreds of randomized control trials found that nearly every meta-analysis of psychotherapy favored it over control conditions. In other words, mental health professionals from decades of research consistently find that talking therapies do actually work. BetterHelp is an entirely online therapy platform designed to make that process incredibly simple. You can connect with a licensed therapist from your home on your schedule through video, audio, or even text with literally no fuss at all. What I like about it is that you can switch therapists at any time until you find someone who you personally can build rapport with and open up to, which is such a critical part of therapy at no extra cost. If you've ever thought about trying therapy, or you're just feeling a little bit stuck in your own head lately like I was, this might be a great first step that I really couldn't recommend more. Visit betterhelp.com/giantshoulder to get 10% off your first month. That's betterhelp/giantshoulder, and in doing so, you also support the channel. Links are down below, because sometimes the most powerful way to understand your own brain is just to talk about it.
Because ultimately, I mean, deciphering reality sounds incredibly cool as a sentence, but what the economy wants and what society wants is like practical applications. Like, how is it going to make medicine better? How is it going to make our technology better? What do you think making genuine improvements in consciousness, how do you think that would actually impact society? Like, how do we actually use those developments to improve our lives?
When you mean those developments, do you mean the physics stuff that we were talking about, or do you mean consciousness research in general?
Well, I'm sort of unifying the two a little bit because I'm now
Well,
on this train of like, how do we build physics equations from conscious agent theory? How does conscious agent theory make predictable experiments that we can test and falsify? And once, if that maths became really formalized and we really started figuring out if consciousness was fundamental and this was how the world works, like how are we better off for it? It's hard to know how that actually extrapolates to the real world.
well, if you believe that the material system or physical system, I mean, the brain is infinitely complex, and we don't really know what it does, and there can be so much stuff which is happening. So there's a lot of room to kind of explain things, which we currently don't understand. And if such a theory helps us to understand even a little aspect of it, which is related to subjective experiences, then that could have potentially a lot of benefits. That's not related to this physics stuff. But it's related to this whole idea that you need to explain physical processes, or you need to understand physical processes based on an understanding of consciousness, and not the other way around. So
Yes.
consciousness needs to explain physical stuff, and not
Yeah.
physical stuff to consciousness.
Yeah.
So I think that's a very general direction view.
So how does the interface theory of perception connect with conscious agent theory? Because while I was researching and looking into this more, again, I think that the interface theory of perception is like a perfectly valid biological idea, but I don't
Yes.
think you think it's biological. So then I'm curious. First off, is it a theory of brain function, or is it a theory of reality?
Well, you said biological and brain function; those are two different things. Like biology is much more. It's much bigger than. I mean,
Yeah.
explaining how the brain works is part of biology, probably, but it's not.
Take it as
No.
either, but I mean, like, is it biology? Is it a biological thing? Is it a brain thing? Is it a reality thing?
So I think the interface theory, as I said in the beginning, you can pair it up with different approaches. I mean, you could stay with a materialist theory and just take the interface theory. You are not necessarily tied to this view of consciousness as fundamental. Even though the interface theory, if you radically think it through, um, might give you some troubles when saying, okay, you believe in a fundamental physical bedrock base reality. You could do that when you say, okay, there is a difference between physical reality and our perception of physical reality. And the interface theory has something to do with the perception of physical reality, but it doesn't really necessarily have something to do with physical reality. I think
Right.
you can try to circumvent this problem that the interface theory might cast. But you can also be very skeptical and say, well, this idea of distinguishing physical reality and our perception of physical reality is somehow fishy. Physical reality arises from the perception of physical reality, or it's a kind of construct that we build on our perception of physical reality, or on our perception. And then the interface theory might lead you toward a view where you are not happy to have physical reality as your bedrock principle. But if you're saying, well, you anyway don't believe in physical reality, you believe in information as fundamental, then that might be very different. That might be much more reconcilable with something like an interface theory. So I can't say it from the top of my head how that would work.
Yeah.
But I think you could go there. Now, but you can of course also go into the direction where you say, okay, consciousness is fundamental. I think that's also perfectly fine. It's just not logically necessary to do that. I think it's motivated if you take the hard problem seriously. But if you don't have this motivation. Or another motivation, if you think that a purely physical cosmology would be devoid of meaning, and you think that's you're a realist about meanings, then you might also not go into the physicalist direction. So what I say is these two lines of thinking, interface theory on the one hand and consciousness is fundamental, or conscious agent theory on the other hand, they could be held together, but not necessarily.
Not necessarily. Yeah. Interesting. Because I
You could
wasn't
also
sure
say,
if one of them.
oh, you believe in consciousness is fundamental, but you think the interface theory is crap.
Yeah. Because I would say that, like, I'm fully on board with the interface theory of perception. Almost all of it. I think it gets very strange for me. All of the things in like physical space being icons that are useful narratives. Absolutely on board with. When you
Right.
start getting to stuff like space time as an icon, I just don't really know what that sentence means. Like,
Right.
icon is sort of this infinite idea, really, and I think I'm fully on board with it in many places, but space time being an icon is a little strange. Could you
Mm.
explain that one?
Yes. So when you think about space-time, it's not directly content that you experience. It's something like a structure, an inference based on your experience.
Yes. I'm
And I think that's the crucial thing. And if you're a realist about space-time, then you would say something like, well, I think the perception that's kind of, forget about that. But still, the construct that we made out of perceptions for several hundred years, that's a real thing. So you're kind of forced to this position. That seems to be a bit, well, you probably could hold it, but it seems to be a bit inconsistent or a bit strange to have it. You don't experience space time directly. Uh,
yes.
well, we experience space, or well, actually, we don't experience space. We experience objects, and then we say, okay, a kind of coherent theater for it. Then we call that space. Um, but you elaborate on that, and then you get to space time.
So that I get that we almost certainly, or maybe you would say certainly, don't experience space time as it is or remotely like what it is objectively. But what I'm a little bit confused about is like why is it necessarily that it's so completely different to what we perceive? Like there's something in our perception that is warping an objective nature of space time into what we perceive space time to be. What
Mhm.
I'm maybe a little bit confused about is why are you able to extrapolate from that it's nothing like what we perceive? Like there could be some similarities, there could be some elements that we tap into. Why is it that you said that the more complex the perception, basically the less likely it is, or the more complex the structure, the less likely our perception is to be accurate? Is that right? Like why is that's never made sense to me in the game theory simulations, in any aspect. It seems like fitness and truth have got to be aligned in places. They've got to be somewhat correlated. They've got to be in touch in some way. Why they're completely separate is a little bit confusing to me.
So we have this other paper. I'm a co-author. Chetan Prakash is the first author on the paper, which was published a few years ago in Entropy, where we say, okay, veridical perception could be construed as or the question is whether our perception preserves the structure
Yeah.
of an external world. And then you could define an arbitrary structure, and you could ask, well, is this structure preserved? And generically, no. And that would be the answer. And then it basically answers your question. It says, no, there is no conceivable structure where we have good reason to believe that it's preserved.
How would you know that it's not preserved?
Oh, because our perceptions are tuned to fitness, and fitness functions can be, if you don't specify further constraints, and then there's the question of how can you do that and why do you do that. You would say, okay, perceptions need to follow this fitness structure, but it's very unlikely that the structure of these fitness functions preserves the structure of objective reality.
That's I guess where I'm confused on why necessarily that is. And even when you're setting up these game theory simulations, space time has to exist in the simulation, right? Like you can't. That's another thing that I was unsure about is like, what do you set as bedrock reality in those simulations? Because you're creating an environment and you're getting two agents with different functions, and the one that is prioritizing, or the one that is prioritizing fitness survives better than truth, and those perceptual faculties evolve. What is bedrock reality in that case? And is space, how does space, specifically related to space time, how could space time be set up in that simulation if it's a
I think space or space time doesn't really figure in these simulations.
okay?
Um, but of course, there's an argument about circularity that it's sometimes made, that when we say something like we don't perceive any structure veridically, we base this claim on an evolutionary theory, and evolutionary theory is a theory about things that move in space. So in that sense, you have you might have an indirect reference to space-time in this kind of arguments. So that would be the argument about self-reference. But I think in the simulations themselves, space and time actually do not figure at all. It's
Right.
just a space of properties and relations between them. And then you ask, how are the functions that you can define on that preserved or not? So there's no direct notion of space involved there.
Because what I have in my head is not particularly accurate. Like I'm basically imagining like Minecraft, and there's two agents in like a Minecraft sort of simulation. And obviously in Minecraft there is time and space, right? Because your agent is navigating a physical world. I'm kind of confused to how you can have a simulation that doesn't have space or time in it.
Yes, I think time is even more difficult because
Yeah, like you have to run the simulation for a certain amount of time, no?
right, exactly, and something happens and change is happening in the simulation. But one answer would be that the time, how we think about time, is normally a bit more involved than just a computer ticking away, tuck, 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 and that seems to be a very impoverished notion of time.
Okay.
So that's one way to get around this worry. But in principle, I think it's an important philosophical question also, to think about time and the nature of time. Whether you don't need you don't need to presuppose some notion of time in order to get the argument off the ground, and then you can't argue against it. But with space, yeah. So from our perspective, when we set up the simulation when we set up Minecraft a game, then we see something which would correspond to space in our I use the interface language.
Yes.
Part of our interface, but from the perspective of the creatures in Minecraft, I'm not sure whether they perceive that space or not.
That makes both of us. I have no idea. the I was speaking to Professor Lee Cronin, who's doing really, really cool work in different
Yes.
spaces and building chemical computers and stuff. And he was like very hard on the fact that like it's bullshit when physicists say time doesn't exist. Of course time exists. And I'm kind of with them on that. I'm like, how can it not? Like, what is like the podcast has been going for an hour and 6 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what isn't that real? Like, what has what has that been if that's not time? Is like, do you understand what I mean? Like, that's how do you think about time? Like, like I understand that in the most basic, where I rudimentarily understand that in the most fundamental physics equations, time kind of gets taken out of it, and you can describe reality without it. Fair enough. I believe the physicists in their maths, but like we experience something that we call time.
Mm.
If it is warped in some way from the actual structure of reality, I don't know, but we experience time. No.
I think the important question is whether it's a format that applies to our experience, or whether it's an objective quantity that kind of where experience exists in. And I think that's a different. That those are two slightly different things. So as in the simulation, the Minecraft game,
Yeah.
there's this distinction whether it appears as temporal to us who design and run the simulations, or whether you would say, okay, from the perspective of the people in Minecraft, there is something like a time ticking, or there's something like a temporal structure. And the interface theory would then say something like, okay, from the perspective of those Minecraft people, it's quite unlikely that there is something, unless we set up the simulation that it looks like that. But if it's just an evolutionary simulation, then probably not. Then it's generically not the case. So when you say time doesn't exist, then I would qualify that a bit. I would say it doesn't exist as an objective theater that we kind of partake in. And maybe it's the way how we necessarily need to conceptualize what's going on. But
Yeah.
that's not quite the same as saying that's the nature of what's going on.
Yes, I'm on board with that. Like I'm very much on board with the idea that the things that we perceive don't accurately describe some underlying structure of bedrock reality. There's a perception function that warps everything. Do you think that one of the good reasons to believe that space time is not how it seems are these weird quantum entanglement experiments that seem to show this faster than light transfer of information, miles away, where you interact with one particle over here and it's an entangled particle here changes its state. Is this sort of a piece of evidence in your mind for this space-time being an icon, that it's clearly not how we see it because that information transfer is happening and it seems to violate our laws of physics? Is that the right way to think about it?
Uh, yes and no. So first of all, I think it's very interesting in a sense that it suggests, well, as you said, base reality might not be temporally or spatially structured. I think I'm on board with that. If you say it suggests that, I wouldn't say it's evidence for that, because there are different interpretations of how these things work. But I think they even show something which is more interesting, namely that when you say what you can't do, actually, you cannot use that for communication. You cannot transfer signals with speeds larger than the speed of light. So there's this no signaling theorem. So even though in entanglement you have correlations between spatially separated locations, you can't use those correlations in order to transfer information between them. And,
Right.
um, and that's very weird, actually. I think the situation that's kind of twisting our mind, or twisting my mind at least. And one
Mine
way
too, don't worry.
to make sense of it, I think, would be to say, okay, this weirdness which is posed by entanglement just stems from a conflation of the way how we think about reality, or how we structure, how we build these interfaces of reality, and try to um, make sense of whatever physicists are telling us, or fundamental physics is telling us within this framework. And then
Yes.
we get these very weird points like entanglement.
Right. That also makes sense to me, that it's evidence that our intuitions about the universe aren't in any way accurate, because we have these physics equations that are physics experiments and equations that just don't make any sense within our framework of how things work. Like, I think that's a good. I think that's. Do you think that that's evidence? Do you think the physics experiments in themselves provide evidence that consciousness is fundamental? Like, there's a strange interaction between this observer effect and experiments, and there seems to be some sort of strange sort of interaction that we don't understand between consciousness and the universe, and these double slit experiments where a conscious observer seems to change the result of physical reality, and those sort of, like, do you think these are sort of signals that your ideas might be more correct? Because I don't hear consciousness being fundamental crowds making that argument, but in my mind, that is like the only argument that makes sense to me, is that quantum mechanics has all this strange stuff that doesn't really make sense. But then if consciousness is fundamental, that's signaled to me that maybe there's something there. There's something there. I don't know what it is, but it's weird and murky. I don't understand it, but I don't often hear that crowd make those kind of arguments.
So on the one hand, I would be probably quite happy if you said something like, oh, some of the weirdnesses that we find in fundamental physics are signatures of consciousness. But on the other hand, I'm a bit hesitant to actually say that, because there's a long history of this consciousness collapsing the wave function idea, and that hasn't turned out to be a very useful way of thinking, and most physicists are actually not thinking about it this way. Um, And I think those are two slightly different ways. And then
Okay.
there's a danger to conflate it. If you say something like consciousness is fundamental and fundamental physics gives evidence for it, then that might be construed as kind of being an advocate of this consciousness collapse theories that have been out there for quite a while, which are well known.
Yeah.
But I mean, just to your point, I think when you say you use the word intuition, and I would say I would go a little bit step further than just saying intuition. I would say intuition, which includes the typical way how we conceptualize our world, the perceptual format that we typically have, or that what we infer from the perceptual format. I think that should be that I would include that into what you call an intuition about the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then
Makes sense.
that's kind of violated, or there's evidence that that's violated in this experiment.
Conversations with you absolutely fry my brain, but they're so interesting. They're such big questions. So hard to come to anything that seems reasonable. You're just in uncomfortable chartered waters the whole time, but super interesting conversations, and I really do like how you communicate them. How does
Thank you.
everything that we've been talking about fit into this conversation of conscious AI? I think we touched on it last conversation a little bit. I'm curious if your perspective has shifted at all in the last 6 months or so since that conversation. Like, how does conscious AI, how does that all feed together into this now project of people trying to build, to use Mark Solom's words, machines that give a damn, which I like as a framework. How do you think about that?
Yes, it's actually good that we talk about that, because since the last time we spoke, it was one of the things where I was thinking about quite often. Um, so maybe it's good to kind of contrast what I think about conscious AI with two ways how people think about it. The first way, and that's the kind of newspaper, social media, Twitter kind of way how these ideas are communicated. It's this question whether AI can reproduce certain kinds of behaviors which we associate with consciousness. So in the easiest case, whether it talks in a way that's kind of, oh, I'm afraid of dying, or something like that. So I think that's the first level. Consciousness researchers are typically very skeptical about these claims.
Yeah.
Often made in the media, but consciousness researchers say, nah, not quite. I think the large majority would actually say that our current AIs, it's not a question about possibility, but just a question about our current AIs are not conscious. I think the majority of consciousness researchers would say something like that.
Yeah.
And they have a different perspective on this problem, namely the perspective of functionalism, whether AIs, it's not a question how AIs behave or what outputs they generate, but how they do it. What's the architecture behind it? And then they would say, okay, if the AI instantiate a certain architecture that we know from theories of consciousness, from neuroscientific theories of consciousness, are likely candidates for producing these correlates or for causing conscious experiences, whether they're global workspaces or recurrent forms of processing or predictive processing mechanisms. Then there are people who think about conscious AI, who think that's a good thing to think about. And it's really just this question whether those AIs implement those architectures or not. Now, I think this perspective is actually not quite right. I would say something like, well, it's not just a question whether they implement those architectures, but how they use those architectures.
Yeah.
How the architectures contribute to a relational richness, to mediating meaningful interactions between an agent and its world. And they can, and that's very fine. It's interesting. But just having this architecture in place doesn't tell you whether they do that. So you could construe that if you want. You could construe that it's a necessary, or it's an important part of a biological understanding, whether those architectures are embedded in a biological entity. Some people would probably go into that direction, like Emil Seff, for example, who thinks about biological naturalism. So I'm actually, although I was initially very skeptical about this tying it to biology, I'm sympathetic to it, not because I think not because it's necessarily the specific substrate which is important. I think that's not what is important, but what is important is this embedding those architecture in a relational system. And ultimately, I would say, okay, the question of conscious AI should be reframed or rephrased as the question whether we could use AI to build these interfaces. And interfaces just enable some meaningful interactions. And AIs can be perfect tools to do that. Material systems like the brain are other tools to do that. It's really the question of how can we construct these interfaces.
What would that mean for an AI model to have interfaces? Because it
Yeah, I mean,
actually does, right? That's a computer. That's a computer metaphor, right? The desktop interface is actually a computer metaphor. So what would that mean in the way that you mean, in the sense that you mean it?
right. So in the desktop metaphor, I mean, just in a metaphor, you always have a user that does something. And the
Yeah.
question is whether you can replace that user that does something with an AI. And I'm a bit skeptical that you can do that. I think you can build these desktops and you can design desktops using AI. But the question is whether you can replace the user that stands behind those desktops. You have this, I would say, focusing on conscious AI from a purely functional perspective. It's like saying you have these switchboards, for, I don't know when it was, 50 years ago, when you made a phone call, you called a lady and then they switched the cables.
Yeah.
You also need to plug into those switchboards. And that's typically not treated in this conscious AI discourse, how you can, or the way that you can use it for plugging in. And I think that's a crucial question that we still need to, which is unresolved. Also whether AIs can actually do that, or whether AIs can also implement the use, whether they're limited to kind of building these interfaces, or whether they can also provide us with a user that actually uses these interfaces to do something interesting.
Right. Because we have what's called AI agents, right? And they can browse the web and they can click buttons, but that's not like, I don't think no one would really say that that's conscious, even though it can, even in the way that the computer metaphor is used for human beings. Like, an agent will look at a screen and it can move files into a desktop or into a bin. Like, so all of those things are literally icons on its interface, funnily enough. But that's not, there's nothing in that that's consciousness. That's just, well,
No,
I
I
don't
think
even.
I think the talk of AI agents, the agents which the concept of agents is very different from. I mean, it's not, typically when an AI agent, you give it a task, you say, oh, do this and do that, and then it carries out that task. Ideally, it would carry that out, and it doesn't work quite right. But that's very different from how we, for example, in biology would think about agency, which is more
Yeah.
self-directed, of having goals of their own, coming, having actual problems. So
So
the
I get,
AI don't have problems.
yes.
They get tasks, but they don't have real problems.
So then, what do you think a computer program having the biological sense of agency would look like? Like, what are the properties of that? What would it need to be endowed with?
That's a good question. So, I mean, from this perspective of consciousness as fundamental, I would even go one step further. I would say, okay, this whole idea of biological agents, of biological embodiment, that might be just an icon for something. We call it the metaphysical version of agency. Now, of course, then you can ask a further question, oh, what would it need to kind of implement that? And then you could, at one point, say, oh, you cannot implement that on a computer. You can just use a computer when you have that. That would be one possibility, but it's very hard to get to say something empirically valid when it comes to consciousness, because the only kind of access that we have to consciousness is through our own first-person experience. Now, I think we could use AI to kind of expand that or to extend that, or to integrate various other kinds of information processes within our own subjective experience. And I think that's already a pretty cool thing. But whether we can go beyond that, I'm a bit skeptical.
Because people have given me different answers to that question. Like one thing that Mark Solms seems to think is important is that the AI system might need to be in control of its own
Mm.
life in some way. So a fundamental property of biology is that it persists through time,
Mhm.
and it's a control system that is regulating the resources or it's for its own survival. And he think
Right.
that might be crucial to conscious AI. Now, I have no idea what that actually means in the context of a conscious computer. Is it able to plug itself out, or it's regulating its own electrical current in some way? Like I don't really know what that means. But that's an interesting idea where you're taking what seems to be a fundamental property of biology and seeing how it works in computer silicon chips, and that's an interesting idea.
Mhm.
Ryota Kanai said that he thinks sort of internal representation is extremely important. Another aspect of biology is that we create models of ourselves, we create models of our environment, and then we basically have this prediction engine, which is the brain that is simulating what might happen in the future and then is regulating our resources based on those predictions. Again, what that necessarily means exactly for a computer program, for an I don't really know. Do you think there's promise in that idea of, maybe you don't because you see consciousness maybe not grounded in those biological properties necessarily, but what do you think about that approach for building computers that give a damn?
So I think it's very interesting if you say, okay, you have this basic biological properties, and then you try to translate it into this kind of AI language. Um, the way I would think about it from the perspective of the interface theory, or from conscious agent theory, would be to say, okay, those biological properties are not fundamental properties themselves. There are more fundamental properties about that have to do with consciousness, and you need to make the question would be whether you could implement those into computer architectures. And my answer would be I don't know, but I think it's an interesting question.
Do you think it's more likely possible or more likely not possible as we stand today? And I guess,
So
I guess
what is what I think what is possible to do is to construct computer systems, artificial systems, which facilitate consciousness, or which enable conscious systems to uh, become more conscious, under quotation marks, to enrich their experience. I think that's perfectly possible, and we probably should do that. Um, where I'm skeptical is to say, well, you can completely replace the conscious agent by a computing system. You can boot up consciousness from unconscious computer processing. I don't think that works. So
and
I'm
what do you
simply
think that
a lot of
model?
ideas which are floated in AI consciousness, um, but I, I would say well, the problem with AI consciousness is not so much how we think about consciousness, but more how we think about physical stuff.
Can you explain that a little bit more?
Well, um, so normally the approach in conscious AI would be to say, okay, we need to kind of mimic the certain correct physical properties, and then we have these conscious computers. Um, and I think from the perspective of conscious agent theory, these physical properties that we need to mimic, that might be ultimately the wrong thing to look for. Um, in the beginning, we talked about this kind of enriched information story that you might need to tell, and the question is really how to design this sufficiently enriched version of information theory, not how to build information, make it more complex and complex in order to get to consciousness.
Right. Super interesting. Yeah, I have absolutely no idea. I spoke to philosopher called Thomas Metzinger, very
Mhm.
famous consciousness researcher as well.
Yes.
You know, he tried to sign this famous moratorium on AI development because he was worried about creating conscious suffering, which is just such a strange idea. I know this idea that we could create something in computer silicon chips that is capable of suffering, and that sort of by accident will just create an enormous amount of suffering consciousness in the world. Do you do you buy that? Are you like, yeah, can a computer suffer?
I mean, I know Thomas Metzinger very well, and he's one of the great philosophers out there in philosophy
Yeah,
of mind. He's very thorough in his thinking, so
he's
I'm
great. Yeah, we had a great
I
conversation.
actually
Yeah,
don't agree with I don't agree with some of the things he says there. So I don't think that we create suffering. Um, but what is right, and that's really worrisome, and he's perfectly right to point it out, is that we are in danger of suffering is a potential form of consciousness, and it exists out there. And we have this danger of there is this danger of, well, bringing it to the world, figuratively speaking. We don't create it. I think we
yeah,
don't create suffering. Suffering exists, but we enrich the universe with sufferings, and that's certainly not a nice perspective. Whether the best way, strategically, the best way would be to make this moratorium, I'm not sure.
yeah. So, what's the right way of thinking? So, suffering exists in the universe, and it, like, in his view, we would create some sort of architecture which resonates with the suffering of the universe or instantiates that suffering, or like it's that interaction which is really the key part here, right? That if suffering is sort of out there in the universe in some way, we would create an architecture which somehow sinks in with it, resonates with it, instantiates it. Like, what's do you have any intuition on like what that relationship is?
So, one thing that I would add to that, I would say, well, suffering is an experiential form, if you want to use that term. Um, it exists in its potentiality. I mean, well, it's also realized, but in addition, it exists in a potential form, and we bring it to actualization. Philosophers would call that, like in a Platonic
Right.
picture, where you create these little instances of more general experiential forms. And I think that this danger is there. Um, Now, what that would concretely mean, how we would concretely do that, I have no idea.
Right.
Um,
But is it like almost the potential energy of a pendulum, you know, as it's converted to kinetic, and you know, as or a ball at the top of a slope has potential energy. Like there's potential suffering gets converted to or instantiated as real suffering through a
yes, I think
transformation of the system in some way.
that's a nice metaphor to think about it. Um, Normally, when we in physics, when you have this pendulum stuff, what you would normally say is that there's some conversation going on, a conservation between forms of energy. And I'm
Yes.
not sure whether that applies to this example.
Right. Right. Super interesting. I always love my conversations with you. There's so much fun. I learn so much. My brain gets fried. I think we're both pretty much at the limits of what our brains are capable for a conversation like this. But it's been so much fun. What are you working on at the moment? What are the big experiments that you're working on? What's your day job at the moment?
So at the moment, I was mainly programming up some stuff, um, which I call it Q network, which is about the relation between third person data and first person perspective. So it's a bit of an outgrowth of my work in phenomenology, trying to
Interesting.
mathematize that and to make this connection between the things that we measure and see and the things that we can experience.
Interesting. You're familiar with Johannes Kleiner?
Yes, I know Johannes very well.
Yeah, yeah, I spoke with him a couple of weeks ago.
Oh,
Yeah, yeah, I presumed you are in two similar spaces and geographically co-located, so that there'd be no way you wouldn't know of each other. It's Robert, so much fun as always. I really, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for a great
well, thank
conversation.
you very much for having me here and for having a certain um, dissenting voice as well.
I appreciate it. I appreciate it. Thank you, Robert.
Okay, have a nice day.
The Giant Shoulder mission is to explore radical ideas in biology, neuroscience, and consciousness, and elevate those stories to the highest possible level while keeping them accessible to everyone. If this interests you and you want to support independent science, then please consider subscribing to the Clips channel. Check out our 26 Neuroscience book. You can download it for free